Ever since Meghan and Harry sold Queen and now King and country down the river for revenge and a quick buck, people all over the world have accused them of treason. But global condemnation aside, do their actions actually fit the crime? Let's find out. Welcome back to part 2 of Treason, where we delve into the history of this capital offense to try to answer the following. Are Meghan and Harry actually guilty of treason? And by the way, if you haven't watched part 1, then I highly recommend that you do so by either following this card up here or the link in the description box below. We basically discuss the origins of treason and examine some of the most notable examples of royals who have literally lost their heads over it, whether they were actually guilty of treason or not. As for today, we'll be picking up right where we left off, the reign of treason, brought to you by King Henry VIII. In part 1, we ended our journey with Anne Boleyn, who many historians believe was framed for adultery, incest, and high treason. But Anne wouldn't be the last Tudor wife to be accused of adultery and treason and lose her head over it. Enter the very young and by all accounts vivacious Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th and penultimate wife. Unlike his attitude towards Anne, Henry, who was 49, obese, and in poor health, was absolutely besotted with his new teenage bride. He was known to dote on her and indulge her every whim. And so it wasn't apathy, as was the case with Anne, but jealousy that led to Catherine's demise, which was instigated when the king had found out about her premarital affairs with various men, including a potential marriage to one Francis Derham, as well as alleged adultery, so post-marriage to Henry, with her cousin, courtier, and friend of the king, Thomas Culpeper. I swear to God, if you're going to tell me Culpeper is not pronounced that way.
Culpeper.
Haha. Now, if you've seen part 1, which again, you really should, you'll recall that adultery committed by the queen is not technically treason, at least as per the Treason Act of 1351, which was a hurdle that Henry and his advisors had already encountered with second wife Anne Boleyn. And in Catherine's case specifically, neither were premarital affairs considered treasonous. But if you know anything about Henry VIII, then you'd know that he had his ways with working around the Treason Act. And by that I mean completely disregarding it, which was exactly the nightmare that Parliament wanted to avoid when the act first came into law in 1352. But unlike with Anne, the allegations against Catherine, especially the premarital ones, not only didn't have to be fabricated, but had pretty solid evidence backing them up, including confessions by Catherine during her interrogation, as well as an intimate letter that she had written to Thomas Culpeper, which still exists today. And so the only thing that Henry had to do to punish his young bride was to make it treasonous for an unchaste woman to marry the king, thereby expanding the definition of treason even further. And so in 1542, Parliament did just that by passing the Royal Assent of Commission Act of 1541, which declared it an act of treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. So they basically created a law and applied it retrospectively to implicate Catherine. As if that wasn't bad enough, the young Catherine was convicted by a bill of attainder, meaning she was stripped of all her civil rights and was declared guilty without a formal trial. She, along with the men implicated with her, were executed in 1542 at the Tower of London. She was only 19 years old. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, ascended the throne. And having witnessed the chaos that his father's reign of treason had caused, Parliament repealed all treason laws that were created by Henry VIII in Edward's first year, as sovereign, thereby ending his father's reign of treason and once again limiting the definition of treason to the one provided by the Treason Act of 1351, in addition to a new act, which is no longer in force, the Treason Act of 1547. Unfortunately, as much as that was a step in the right direction, that didn't automatically mean that all was right in the world and innocent royals were no longer targeted. Take Lady Jane Grey. Edward VI's cousin and also a devout Protestant, was chosen by the dying Edward as his successor in 1553 to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary I from ascending the throne, even though she was technically the rightful heir. The thing about Lady Jane is that she was very reluctant. She wasn't just this switched off teenager. She was aware of what her family was doing, and she was practically coerced into going along with their plans, which included declaring her queen. Sadly for her, Mary, who was actually quite popular with the people, who all saw her as the rightful heir, which she was, replaced Jane as queen 9 days after Jane was proclaimed queen, which is why she's known as the 9-Day Queen, leading to Jane's arrest along with that of her husband for committing high treason for being a usurper queen. And to back up this allegation with evidence, a letter that Jane had signed as Jane the Queen was used during her trial. Now, Mary knew that Jane and her husband were most likely used as pawns in the plans of their families, and so she felt pity for them and didn't want them put to death. And so instead, she decided to set them up at the tower, at least Jane, and give her quite a comfortable existence. And that's what ended up happening for a while until Jane's father, who, by the way, literally abandoned his daughter for dead and ran to save his own hide when Mary was proclaimed queen, had sealed his daughter and son-in-law's fate when he foolishly and selfishly involved himself as a leader in the Wyatt's Rebellion, which was basically a rebellion against the proposed marriage of Mary I and Prince Philip of Spain. Now, despite Jane not knowing anything of this rebellion and not being involved with it whatsoever, this move had convinced Mary and her advisors that Jane would always be a threat to Mary's reign as long as she lived, because she was a Protestant and Mary was Catholic. And so, reluctant as Mary was, she was eventually convinced by her advisors to sign the order for Jane's execution on the 19th of January, 1554. But even so, Mary still tried in vain to save Jane's life by sending her the Abbot of Westminster to convert her to Catholicism, which Jane refused, allegedly saying in response, "It is not my desire to prolong my days." And so on the 12th of February of 1554, right after her husband's execution, Jane was executed for high treason. This painting here is based on that day when Jane, who had blindfolded herself and was described as being incredibly brave and composed, momentarily lost her composure as she blindly felt around for the block to place her head on, panicking when she couldn't find it. She was eventually guided to it and said a final prayer before the end. She was only 16, 17 years old. So far, like who talks like that? So far, we've looked at examples of sovereigns using treason laws to eliminate their opponents or to get rid of people they don't like. But what if I told you that the Treason Act was once used against the reigning sovereign himself? Enter Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland from 1625 until his eventual execution in 1649. In a nutshell, because Charles' story is actually quite complicated and interesting, but I need to keep it limited to treason, Charles wasn't exactly a fan of Parliament. He was more of an authoritarian king like his father, James VI of Scotland, believing in the divine right of kings and that only God, and certainly not Parliament, can overrule them. And so he kind of wanted Parliament out of the way. Now, unfortunately for Charles, there was this little thing that was drawn up and signed up around 4 centuries before he came to be called the Magna Carta. which is when people in 1215 went, you know what, this whole barbaric king above everyone and not subjected to the law is kind of old-fashioned. I mean, it's 1215. We got to get with the times. This isn't 6000 BC. Time to write up new laws. And they did, the Magna Carta, which basically limited the king's powers and made it very clear that the king and his government are not above the law, but are in fact subject to it. A notion which Charles wanted to do away with. Obviously, Parliament wasn't too happy about that, and they kept clashing throughout his reign until they ended up in a civil war between parliamentarian forces and the king's army. Eventually, the king lost the war, which dragged on for a few years, and the people blamed him for the destruction that it caused. And the army demanded for him to be put to trial for treason. Thing is, the Treason Act was an act of common law, meaning that any case that was heard under the Treason Act would be tried in the king's bench. And the king, Charles I, is immune. And so a committee advised the House of Commons to basically establish a brand new court, a high court of justice, which was entirely separate from the king's bench, to try the king for treason. And so the House of Commons basically bypassed the House of Lords, who unanimously rejected to try the king, and set up a trial for the king completely on their own, which was revolutionary. It had never happened before. Charles's trial began on the 20th of January, 1649 at Westminster Hall. Now, for his part, Charles had completely refused to enter into a plea and altogether rejected the court's authority over him, declaring the trial to be illegal. The trial proceeded regardless. Now, you'll remember that as per the Treason Act, levying war against the sovereign is an act of treason. But you may also remember from part 1 that the whole purpose of the Treason Act wasn't just to protect the sovereign or the crown, but also to protect the people, the subjects. And that was the argument that the House of Commons ran with. They said, you may not have levied war against yourself, but they accused him of levying war against the kingdom, which the Treason Act exists to also protect. And so that's how they got him, and he was found guilty of treason. What's really interesting is that original court documents from this trial still exist today, including the judgment, which reads, "For all which treasons and crimes this court doth adjudge that he, the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body," which is exactly what ended up happening on the 30th of January, 1649. Would you believe that 2 of his sons ended up succeeding him as kings in the future?
The more you know.
All right, so we looked at the Treason Act of 1351 to determine what treason is as per the law. We also looked at various case studies and learned that for the most part, the act did little to limit the definition of treason, especially in the Tudor era. I'm looking at you, Henry VIII. But now for the question that you are all probably most interested in. I personally find the history infinitely more compelling, but to each their own. What about problematic modern royals? More specifically, could Harry and Meghan be found guilty of treason if, in a parallel universe, they were to be tried today under the Treason Act of 1351, which is still in force? It was last tested at court in 1946 to prosecute one William Joyce for collaborating with the Germans during World War II. He was the last person to be tried and executed under the Treason Act of 1351, and he wasn't a royal. I think we can say that based on the very lax interpretation of the Treason Act at best, and completely ignoring it at worst, again, looking at you, Henry VIII, had Meghan and Harry lived during the Tudor era, in my opinion, they very likely would have been accused of treason had they done any of the things that they've done in the past few years. And that's not because what they did fell under the definition of treason, but because the definition didn't matter. Whatever upset the king or the sovereign was treason. I mean, you remember the shenanigans from part 1? Oh, the king was sad. You hurt his feelings. Therefore, you put his life at risk, and so you're guilty of treason. But realistically, what I have found is that as time progressed, people were far less likely to be charged with treason under the Treason Act of 1351 because it carried the death penalty. For instance, in 1842, after a couple of men attempted to scare Queen Victoria by pretending to shoot her, one of them basically never fired the pistol, and the other one had blanks, just paper and tobacco. So her life was never really technically under threat. Her husband, Prince Albert, concerned about the notion of putting citizens to death if they didn't actually kill or try to kill the monarch, successfully proposed the passing of the 1842 Treason Act, which was created to prosecute lesser crimes against the monarch and doesn't carry the death penalty. We also have World War I, where if you're a regular on this channel and you've watched a video I made a few months ago called The Untitled, all about stripping titles from royals, then you'll remember that the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917 was written up, basically to strip the titles from British princes and peers who have been accused of, and I quote, bearing arms against His Majesty or his allies, or who have adhered to His Majesty's enemies. Now these words, even though slightly updated, are basically taken straight out of the Treason Act of 1351, levying war, adhering to enemies. Meaning these people were basically accused of committing treason, and yet, despite getting their titles stripped for what is technically treason, they were called traitors, they were never prosecuted under the Treason Act. Now, I suspect the fact that these princes were basically all dual citizens, they were either German or Austrian and also held British titles, probably played a part in being spared from being charged under the Treason Act because they were technically serving in their own armies while also being British princes. So it wasn't as clear cut. It's not like a British citizen abandoning his country and going off to serve with an enemy force. Of course, we also have Edward, the Duke of Windsor, whose alleged treason we discussed at great length in my 5-part series, The Sussex-Windsor Files. And despite some pretty solid evidence against him and Wallis, if you believe in the German documents that were uncovered, they were never charged with treason. And despite still being in force today, more modern acts are being used to prosecute treason instead of the original 1351 Act, including the 1989 Official Secrets Act, the 2000 Terrorism Act, and what I mentioned a few minutes prior, the 1842 Treason Act, which was the act that was used to prosecute the man who attempted to assassinate, kill, harm the Queen Elizabeth II, in Christmas of 2021 with a crossbow, if you remember that one. So I think it's safe to say that, firstly, unless we have solid evidence of Meghan and Harry committing a treasonous act as per the law, as per the Act's definition, not our general understanding of treason, which is betraying one's country, then the answer is no, they have not committed treason. There are people who say that they're working with enemies of the Commonwealth, but that's basically conjecture at the moment. The most we can say is that they are inadvertently helping the enemy. They're being useful idiots by diminishing the Commonwealth. But as for anything more than that, actual collaboration, we have no evidence. But secondly, let's play devil's advocate and say, okay, yeah, no, they've committed treason, or there's enough to charge them with treason. They have definitely collaborated with the enemy. Based on recent examples, with Edward and Wallis being chief amongst them, they still wouldn't get charged, let alone prosecuted and convicted of treason under the Treason Act. And that's my answer, basically. Let me know if you agree, and of course, if you disagree. Oh, and don't forget to share this with people who enjoy history or who just like to discuss morbid topics like treason and innocent people getting framed, because this channel's right down their alley. And fundamental laws of liberties, blah, 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 blah. No,